Good evening. If I could get people to take their seats so we can get started. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here. It's so wonderful to see such a large audience, especially as we are working our way towards the end of the semester, to see so many people here and so much energy, so much conversation, so much chatter. It's really wonderful. I want to thank you all for being here for what is our last presentation in the series of new books in anthropology for this semester. I have the honor of introducing our guests this evening. We have two wonderful discussants who are going to discuss this book written by our own João Biehl. And so I get the pleasure of introducing them to you. Lilia M. Schwartz is a professor of anthropology at the University of Sao Paulo and visiting professor at Princeton University. A leading Brazilian public intellectual, Schwartz has received 5 Djibouti prizes for historical, anthropological, and art-related works. She has served as guest curator at the Sao Paulo Art Museum and regularly writes for Brazil's major media outlets. A former Guggenheim and John Carter Brown Library Fellow, Schwartz has also been a visiting professor at Oxford, Leiden, Brown, and Columbia. Her recent publications include Brazil, a biography with Heloisa Starling, and on Brazilian authoritarianism. We also have with us Miqueias Muge, who is a social and political historian whose research examines the political economy of war, slavery, and empire building in Latin America, with particular emphasis on Brazil's southern frontiers. He currently serves as academic research manager at Princeton University's Brazil Lab. His most recent book, Lost Writings, The Life and Work of a Seditious Immigrant, which is co-authored with João Biehl, was published in German and Portuguese and is currently being translated into English. Excuse me. And then our guest speaker for tonight, João Biehl is the Susan Dodd Brown Professor and Chair of Anthropology, as well as the Director of the Brazil Lab at the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. He is the author of the award-winning books Vida, Life in a Zone of Social Abandonment, and Will to Live, AIDS Therapies and the Politics of Survival. He's co-edited several influential collections, including Subjectivity, Ethnographic Investigations, When People Come First, Critical Studies in Global Health, and Unfinished, The Anthropology of Becoming. The latest volume, Home Places, on habitability and livingness in critical times, will be released next year. Over the past few years, Biehl has collaborated on multiple initiatives related to indigenizing conservation science, as well as several historical ethnographic projects. These efforts have culminated in the book Lost Writings, co-authored with Miqueias, which I mentioned, as well as Jammerthal, The Valley of Lamentation, My Muker War, which we are celebrating today. Jammerthal was a finalist for this year's Djibouti Academic Prize in Social Sciences from the Brazilian Books Chamber. Before I turn it over to our wonderful author and panelists for tonight, I do want to just invite everyone to stick around after the conversation and join us for a reception and celebration afterwards. And with that, please join me in welcoming João Biehl.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank Amelia, Jamie João, and Patty Leib from the Anthropology Department and the Brazil Lab for organizing this event. And thank all of you for joining us to celebrate the release of Jammerthal, The Valley of Lamentation, and discuss the Muker War with my dear colleagues Lilia Schwartz and Miqueias Muge. Research is always a collaborative effort, and no book exists without many imaginations and hands at work. I have been fortunate to have Adriana Petrina as a constant interlocutor, and the wonderful assistance of Naomi Zucker, Onur Gunay, Nikhil Pandey, and Aaron Su over the years, as well as the help of friends whose work I also greatly admire, Miqueias, Lilia, Luis Augusto Fischer, and Claudia Laitano. Their sharp probing reconnected me with this manuscript from over 3 decades ago, helping me to rewrite and resurrect it as a book in Portuguese with the remarkable Oikos Publishing House, as well as to fine-tune a larger forthcoming English version. Special thanks to Firestone's librarian extraordinaire, Fernando Acosta Rodrigues, for his support throughout. It is a pleasure to collaborate with the Danish photographer Torben Askerud, whose striking images accompany the book and my presentation. So let's begin. Could this child still be me? I like to think that a child is sincere in this framed environment at the barely functional Grupo Escolar Rincão dos Ilhéus. I had yet to master posing naturally or smiling at the right time. Wearing the school uniform my mom had sewn, I sit in front of the Brazilian map surrounded by the flag with the positivistic motto, order and progress, and by the globe of my fugitive dreams, with my hands, as the teacher ordered, resting over the Portuguese dictionary, a far cry from the Hunsrückische dialect we lived in at home. Since my handwriting was too nascent, my father, who had always been so proud of his cursive writing, carefully signed my name on the memento, just as he used to sign his. I wonder what he saw of himself in this image. There is something the child sees and is yet to write. I experienced a similar sensation of strangeness and desire for familiarity upon returning to Jammerthal, the Valley of Lamentation, a text I initially wrote as my master's thesis in philosophy more than half of my life ago. Never before published in book form, this was my original foray into the Muque War, the first messianic revolt of modern Brazil, which occurred in the country's extreme south in 1874, devastated the German-Brazilian immigrant community, of which I am an accidental descendant. Marked by a precocious melancholy and the yearning for a possible freedom in writing, this revised and expanded Jammerthal insists on seeing things as they are from the perspective of lived experience. Thus, it illuminates both the barbarism of history, who desired war, in which relatives and neighbors attacked and killed each other, and who benefited from it, and a mysterious Mucker longevity that endures in this southern landscape. I have a special affection for this text. It is based on the last manuscript I wrote by hand and in Portuguese before emigrating to the United States. A kind of farewell to the myopic worlds of theology and philosophy, and an emerging approach to ethnographic writing, the text also served as a passport to the unknown that is now my life. Over time, it became both a living memorial of my mortal destiny and fostered the recovery of the creativity and sense of injustice and desire for reparation of my colono ancestry. Throughout my presentation, I use the term colono from an imic perspective. In southern Brazil, colono refers to immigrants who settled in rural areas as small-scale farmers, as well as subsequent generations. This usage emphasizes their identity as simple, unschooled agricultural workers, rather than as colonizers or colonists, terms associated with imperial or colonial expansion. I'm a fifth-generation descendant of poor immigrants who fled hardships and wars in Europe and came to the German colony of São Leopoldo in Rio Grande do Sul, the southern borderland with Argentina and Uruguay, in search of a land and a better future, much like the millions who fled to the US in the first and second half of the 19th century. The land where they arrived was a traditional territory of the Caingangue people, who were either killed or displaced during a failed plantation venture based on enslaved labor. The colonization experiment was part of the imperial military agricultural plan to occupy, defend, and whiten the labor force of this frontier zone. The colonies existed with African slavery, and immigrants interacted violently with indigenous groups that resisted the occupation of their lands. Around the kitchen table and in visits to the countryside, I grew up hearing about the hardships faced by our ancestors, working the land from dawn to dusk, long trips on an ox wagon over perilous roads to deliver products to the city, the lack of access to healthcare, and a century without public education. Fates that my colonial parents would try to circumvent to their offspring. Poignantly, tombstones from those early days conveyed the colonias as a ravaged place and home as a wearing pilgrimage. This sense of unhomeliness and of life as unfulfilled and withering would be my heritage too. I'm a guest on earth, and I have no standing here. Heaven shall be mine. This is my homeland. By the 1860s, the expanding colonies were prospering economically, particularly the rich settlers who relied on forced labor despite provincial law prohibiting immigrants from owning slaves. This breadbasket region was targeted by the Kingdom of Prussia, which wanted to bolster so-called pure German colonies in South America. Meanwhile, an emergent Germanist-Brazilian elite in the colony of São Leopoldo and in Porto Alegre developed the idea, the capital Porto Alegre, of a hiesiges Deutschtum, local Germanism, founded on racial superiority to seek political support for a more expensive neocolonial enterprise. Newly arrived German-educated missionaries denounced the colonists', quote, a-religiosity, and sought to eradicate the common practice of lay priesthood in a fierce crusade for ethnic purification via religion. By all accounts, this frontier was a place of both violence and neglect. Paraguayan forces invaded the province in 1865, and large numbers of German-speaking Brazilian-born young men were recruited to fight in what would become South America's bloodiest war ever. Meanwhile, ordinary colonos created their own therapeutic practices to ward off untimely death, as did those deemed false saints mucker. Around 1868, a pious healing movement emerged centered on the trances and scriptural interpretations of Jacobina Mendes Maurer and the herbal remedies concocted by her husband, João Jorge Maurer, both born in Brazil from immigrant parents with no formal education. As the story goes, the unconscious Jacobina would, in a trance state, communicate enlightenments from the spirit of nature for pilgrims who gathered at her home at the foothills of the Ferrabras mountain. Based on these visions, the wounded doctor, miraculous Dr. João Jorge, would prepare herbal infusions to heal the afflicted. After 3 years in perfect order, as an early participant of the movements would later put it, the group became known as mucker, literally those who dig muck, who are false saints, sanctimonious, and hypocritical. Enveloped in rumors of apostasy, immorality, communism, and murderous crime, those searching for healing at the Maurers were framed as a threat to the very foundations of the colonial enterprise. As the mucker blurred all acceptable categories of difference in that new world, authorities portrayed these homegrown enemies as, quote, bloody primitive Indians and mutinous, quote, white Negroes, and treated them as such. In 1874, after a year of intense intra-ethnic conflict, approximately 100 mucker were hunted down and killed like wild beasts by settler militias. Many were veterans of the Paraguayan War and National Army groups called in by local elites who knew all too well how to massacre dissent. Since then, the term mucker has signified religious madness, sedition, and communal breakdown in that part of my world. As a curse word, it also indexed gradations of citizenship and the social kinds deemed worthy of existence. A violent heuristics for exclusion and capture, mucker is a continuous legend of the colonial present. Bystanders of the conflict, like my ancestors, would hereafter dread the heavy hand of the state, conceal any traces of a nature-bound spirituality, and trust no one. Living in fear that the mucker-like creatures would steal their animals or tear down their homes, they would sleep next to their rifles. The lesson was invariably, man muss sich aufpassen. You have to watch yourself. As my grandpa, Oscar, would hark back to while drinking his nightly bottle of cachaça or sugarcane rum. I was born in the rural settlement of Picada Café, founded in 1844, and grew up hearing stories about Frier, the earlier times in Hunsrückische, a Koine-like oral language resulting from a hybridization of ancestral German dialects with socioletics and Portuguese words. Until first grade, Hunsrückische was the language I lived in. Far from the Hochdeutsch, or High German spoken by urban elites and the clergy, our family, like so many others, called what we spoke as Hecke Deutsch, German from the bushes, the language of potato planting peasants, an impenetrable mesh that seemed to keep us enclosed in a separate field of existence, as it were, excluded from the nation. My mother, Noemia, was taken out of school in 4th grade to help with farming, and my father, Fernando, found his way into a tannery after finishing 5th grade. In the mid-1960s, the young couple migrated with their 2 children to Novo Hamburgo, epicenter of a booming shoe industry. My parents wanted to start a small meat processing business to pay inherited debts and to give my sister Marina and me a chance at studying a destiny other than child labor. Even though we saw a future in the city, the colonias stayed with us. In language and homemade food, for sure, since my paternal grandparents migrated too, and my other grandma, Vaminda, lived with us after her husband set their house on fire. Then there were trips back to the countryside for pork, for the sausages, and to the yearly curb, to this day, the most important festival in German Brazilian communities. But the colonias also stayed in the daily bullying for being colono grossos, coarse settlers, or alemão batatas, German potatoes, even though we had no sense of ourselves as German and knew nothing about that place called Germany. During those years, what was most incomprehensible to me was that my kin, cornered and ashamed, seemed to agree that we were nichts, white, poor, social nothings. Between Novo Hamburgo and the colonias, I found myself distant from both worlds. How I wished I belonged to another place and family, or even none at all. Religion at times did a trick. Monthly Lutheran worship services took place in the salon, big saloon, that worked syncretically as our home, a bodega, a dancing hall, and a church on Sunday morning. Pastor Mann's biblical storytelling was like a movie to me, and his classical education spoke to the elsewhere of civilization I could step into right there into my migrant home. This itinerant theater gave me a first taste of elite culture, leaving me little by little more detached from my supposed origins, with a hunch that the more invented, the more real one is. While enveloped in estrangement and an early resolve to escape, I was still struck by things from this other space-time that until today kept ripping forgetfulness apart. Like the ointments my mom and grandmas rubbed on our chests in cold winter, and the prayers and teas of the healing lady who lived a few blocks from us and who once even fixed my broken leg. I saw this human plant caregiving applied equally to the living and the dead. I would join beloved Vaminda every month in her pilgrimage to the grave of her son Edu, who had lived with us and had been killed by a drunk driver. I helped her pick the flowers from our garden and carry the flowers and wash each and every one of the little stones adorning Edu's grave. Unbeknownst to me, Vaminda was gifting me an ancestral figure of the unwritten in the form of death. In my late 20s, I began to revisit the landscape of my early childhood. Having lost my bearings, I was looking for my own Jammerthal, or Valley of Lamentation, the name of the most remote of the old colonies, where I could find some beauty and respite. After studying and abandoning theology and journalism, and spending months in Germany, no, I could not shed my bastardized language. I struggled to finish my master's thesis while hoping for graduate school acceptance in the US. Loathing analytical philosophy, I was drawn to what reason actually does in the world, and risked taking the Muka War as my subject. I knew there was much more than religious fanaticism in the Civil War that social science had myopically rendered as a nostalgic millennial movement. I wanted to identify who actually desired war and to exhume the fantastic rationality underpinning the vilification and eradication of a Mucker way of life. I searched for the infamous Mucker in the archives of power in São Leopoldo, Porto Alegre, Rio de Janeiro, and Berlin. Step by step, the conflict revealed itself as intricately multiscalar. Relegated to the dregs of Brazilian history and left to impunity, the Mucker War occurred against the backdrop of neocolonial expansionism, connecting Europe to the southern frontier, and reflected intricate regional politics and the racialization patterns fostered by the ruling classes, as well as pockets of insurgency. I found evidence that the philosopher and journalist Karl von Clausewitz and his Germanist allies, in cahoots with German missionaries, had actively choreographed the conflict through sensationalist accounts, false testimonies, police raids, and deportation petitions. Clausewitz mocked the MOOC as, quote, white Negroes on the level of African worshippers, and even, quote, below Negroes in his Deutsche Zeitung, the largest German language newspaper in the country. In police records, I found that Clausewitz actually testified as an eyewitness against Maurer in December 1873, saying that the healer and his followers were spreading false doctrines, undermining public morals, and introducing communism, extending to their own woman. On August 1st, 1874, the Deutsche Zeitung editorial stated, the Mucker must be hunted like dogs and killed so that no trace of them remains. Even though the band can hardly read, these fanatics want to reform today's world according to their visions. As I learned, Mucker messianism was a literary construct of the white man of reason, capital, and God, who sought to eradicate the supposed backwardness and self-government of the very colonists they claim to represent. Their goal was to re-Germanize these colonus as part of their broader campaign to scale purity south of the equator, in Clausewitz's own words. The owners of the literary means of production won the war they wanted. Until then, these elites had been systematically erased from Mucker historiography, their destructive power excised from the broader history of German immigration, a history in which my own submissive relatives had also been imprisoned. For Germany, the South American settlements became a laboratory of sorts for cultural and economic expansionism. An 1874 report by the German Society for Protestants in Southern Brazil stated how important it is to have a tribe that thinks and trades in German, sympathizes with us in commerce and politics, and represents our interests. In the Use and Abuse of History, published at the time of the Mucker War, Friedrich Nietzsche wrote that we are all suffering from a malignant historical fever. The devotion to universal history and obsession with natural supremacy doomed Germany to be, in his words, a decorative culture that both wrongs the past and maims life. In other words, a gravedigger of the present. In the southern colonies, a local form of German culture would be painfully inscribed in the so-called Mucker caste as the embodiment of a primitive and seditious mode of existence. The Mucker would be exterminated as if they were an excrescence of an inexorable project of evolution. With the violent encroachment of neo-colonial white supremacy in the flesh of the false saints, a sense emerged that a certain way of knowing oneself and the world had become devalued and was a thing of the past, and that things could have been otherwise. In the summer of 1991, I visited Vaminda at a nursing house in Ivoti. Battling Parkinson and Alzheimer's, my grandmother was the first in generations to be in assisted living. Sitting in a rocking chair, Vaminda was always waiting for a visitor, real or imagined. I told her about my wanderings through the old colonies and asked her to help me with my research. When I returned, Vaminda had something to tell me. João, the Mooker did not cut the tails of their horses. What does this mean? I asked. It's natural, she said. That's something we don't do to what is ours. In her own way, Vaminda was mocking my fantasies about a magical Mooker presence. Instead, the Mooker were brought into the scene in relation to a real cut, occasioning moral reasoning grounded in what humans can bear as natural. This is the closest I've ever come ancestrally to the Mooker. As I heard it, the word Mooker conveyed lonesomeness, a remembered tie, and inconceivable violence, the voice of a body dehoused. Vaminda transformed the other Mooker into something we don't do to what is ours. The Mooker trace carried both imagined differentiation and a persistent home sentience. The anthropologist faces the circumstantial and extends what is given. To my surprise, when I began assembling personal letters, petitions, and police files, I discovered a most peculiar fact. The families gathering at Jacobina and João Jorge's home had complained to the country's highest authority that the tails of their horses had been mysteriously cut off. 120 years before Vaminda passed the trace to me. This is how the colonos described their existence in a letter to Emperor Dom Pedro II, December 1873. We colonos want to let your majesty know how much we have suffered, not just from our neighbors who are rowdy and conniving, but also from the very authorities, and they cut off the tails and manes of 5 horses. Vaminda's allusion to the cutting of the horse's tail is a remnant of when these alleged deviants began to be expelled from reality. No longer considered Nebenmenschen, fellow humans, the colonos who sought healing and transcendence at the Maurers were identified as Mooker through the mutilated animals they rode. And the colonos turned Mooker would have to articulate their own literary strategy to ensure the survival of their patchy commune and to save their households from tragedy. Call it an anti-colonial insurgency. Years after the massacre, João Daniel Noé recalled the early days of the movement that he and his family participated in. Jacobina began experiencing unconscious episodes after her first son's birth in 1868. When she lost consciousness, she would convey messages from the spirit of nature. Based on these illuminations, João Jorge prepared herbal infusions to alleviate the many afflictions pilgrims brought there. Surrounded by dense forests and without formal medical care, daily life was marked by myriad diseases, accidents, and outbreaks. With high rates of infant and maternal mortality, the specter of death hung in the air. War was also visible in the bodies of the veterans who returned mutilated from the Paraguayan front. I wonder if Jacobina's unconscious episodes might relate to the deadly fate from which she and her baby had escaped, but which she now faced again in her second pregnancy, as if what physical death had failed to provoke, the thought of death would bring about. A delirium and rapture that Jacobina would experience for herself and for those gathered around her with their own hardships and search for health. Jacobina's trances and natural enlightenments enable distinct bodily attunements and community bonds. According to Noé, people wanted, quote, to achieve clarity and not continue to grope in the dark, to have freedom of thought. While the Mucker demands for truth and dignity were silenced by authorities, while Minda and others continue to socialize these traces in the face of death. Such reminiscences take our thinking back to a multiplicity of strangenesses involving kin, neighbors, animals, things, knowledges, and the ruling classes, an escalation of misunderstandings, accusations, cuts, and crimes that transformed simple folk into a supposedly organic entity, the Mucker. From this perspective, civil strife is not a war within the household, as Nicole Leroux theorized ancient Greek stasis, an originary division that enters the polis and is overcome by a new political paradigm of reconciliation. Rather, the Mucker were a reactant that mediated the emergence of hiesiges Deutschtum as a totalitarian political reality. In order to belong to the idealized Germanist parapublic and secure representation and economic opportunity, the colonials would have to relinquish autonomy and abandon their own capacity for transcendence. Increasingly cornered in the Maurer's fortress, as described by the press, the Mucker rebels mounted an impressive counteroffensive, causing significant damage to national troops on June 28, 1874. The defeat exacerbated armed civilians who raided and burned Mucker houses and imprisoned their relatives. Commanders feared the revolt was stirring slave uprisings near the capital. A dispatch from July 6, 1874 notes, "The blacks are clearly up to something. Our slaves are aware of what's going on and waiting for the right time. They might even have an arrangement with the Mucker sect, for they would only find support from this kind of people." By now, members of the German Society for Gymnastics and Hunting had already taken over the civic guard of the capital, Porto Alegre. They wrote to the president of the province, "We want to prove that we by no means share the sentiments of those criminals who call themselves our compatriots. We desire to contribute to their extermination." The crime? Colonial beasts rewinding the world imaginatively, a disgrace to the, quote, civilized and religious German race. The elites feared that the Mucker worked as a quilombo, a refuge for enslaved and fugitive people, perhaps sharing therapeutic knowledge and suggesting a more egalitarian way of life. After the Maurer's house fell, a certain Captain Salgado informed his superiors that among the spoils of war was a 6-year-old black boy named Francisco. The boy's parents may have been part of the Mucker community and killed a child the military man planned to re-enslave. Francisco's unexpected appearance in this archival remnant, alone, speechless, and with no family or origins, allows us to consider the crucial role that the normalization of captivity and the purification of whiteness played in the anti-Mucker Germanist drive and its local traction. Immediately after the war, Koseritz published the essay, "The Mucker Swindle in the German Colony." He said that when executed, Jacobina, quote, exhaled her black soul. A year after the massacre, the Ministry of Agriculture published theses on the colonization of Brazil, vilifying Chinese immigrants as, quote, the embodiment of turpitude, and claiming Germany was, quote, the breeding ground for immigration. The report praised São Leopoldo as the most successful colonization plan. Our children will reap the fruits of this beneficial moral revolution that is taking place in Brazilian society. Even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins. Walter Benjamin reminds us of the crushing effects of ruling classes' historical schemes. But the silence of the past, as Trujillo would say, is not all there is. Destruction is never absolute, and survivals linger. No longer leaving the past behind, I was finding its lures. As I drove into Jammerthal in search of solace and inspiration to tell my Muka war, I would strike up conversations with strangers and visit distant relatives. I collected life stories, attended religious services, and walked through 19th century cemeteries, enraptured by any earthwide remnant that came my way. Like gravestones conveying a familiar sense of transience. We do not have a permanent home here. We are searching for a future one. I was also struck by the earthbound imagery of ancient graves, a sun, a branch of leaves, and at times a heart, a nature-bound spirituality. I was also dumbfounded by what people evoked, like the elder Edgar Jung, who obliquely sided with the Mucker. The Mucker were not bad people, he told me. They were colonos like us. My grandfather said that Jacobina was like Christ. Or Rudolfo, owner of a roadside store that is no more. My grandfather used to say that the Mucker did not cause trouble. People went to Jacobina, celebrated, and returned to their lives. Faced with these revelations, I recalled Benjamin's fascination with flashes, in which history appears concentrated on a single focal point. In these moments that can only take place in a flash, the has-been can be grasped. Embedded in externalities and resonances that required further elaboration, these flashes transfigured into little epiphanies, helping me narrate beginnings, autoethnographic and Mucker, in a new light. As the luminous Sebald writes, they are always returning to us, the dead. In visiting local churches, I found parish registers, Gemeindebücher, that predated German missionaries. Coming through them, I was struck by the high number of child deaths and stunned when I found the 1855 registry of little Elisabeth Dammer's passing in Picada Café. It was not the lay pastor, August Zins, but Frauen aus der Nachbarschaft, women from the neighborhood who buried the newborn in the community's cemetery. Compassionate neighbors, for sure, but was this also a reference to a local midwife or a woman healer, someone like Jacobina? In other registries, I found references to Häuser, houses, where the lay pastor performed baptisms and held worships, and references to families burying the dead on their own land, including the Biehls. Traces of this domestic spirituality and ways of conceiving the body as open to the spirit of nature share beyond the church expanded my perception of the struggle against death grafted onto the landscape, as well as of a kind of colono-magical realism that found expression in Jacobina's trances and João Jorge's medicinal herbs. In this litany of emotions and expectations, a strong and wise spirit would offer enlightenment and relief, and people would infuse themselves with plants from their gardens and the forest. For some, this botany of the mind would be an experience of the sacred. For others, an affective reorientation, touching the world with greater unknown intensity until everything returned to normal, as the elder Noé put it. The only surviving material evidence of this emotion people and their conviviality is a Gesangbuch, a songbook, created by Rudolf Zeng, Jacobina's closest friend, who was also killed alongside her. This homemade artifact is the closest we can get to the erased voices of these pilgrims and how they sounded together before Mucker otherness was inscribed violently on their bodies. O you blissful, O you joyful. Only 2 of 6 songs are Lutheran hymns, O du Fröhliche and Alleluia. The others are popular and classical compositions immigrants brought and taught their children. Der Jäger's Abschied, the Hunter's Farewell, composed by von Eichendorff and Mendelssohn around 1840, combines love of nature with new values. What we silently praised in the forest, we want to honestly preserve outside. Fascinatingly, Rudolph's songbook opens with a folk dance, Tänzergesang, of unknown origin. Yes, the colonos represented themselves there both through kinetic energy and through the movements of their souls. How wonderful to sing with pleasure, how glorious, how beautiful, Yuhei. Thanks to this sonorous relic, we learned that together the colonial pilgrims who flocked to Maura's house created a third space of enlightenment, care, and celebration in synergy with the spirit of nature. Call it a religion of friendship. While these traces of what one does not know, as I like to call them, and religious eclecticism shattered what remained of my historical objectivity, they instilled in me a less certain sensibility. This openness to a colonial existentiary and spirituality, which even erased ethnic boundaries, sharpened my ability to discern what was missing in official narratives and to pay attention to the porosity between living and inanimate, human and other than human beings, in this frontier world marked by the cuts and annulments that came with the Muka War. Beatific moments to be resurrected from the archive of the horrific, which we cannot let die. This autoethnographic immersion, coupled with forays into archives and poetic philosophical reflections, led me to focus on the differences that challenge ongoing history and the life forms and futurities that a people considered worthless felt compelled to implement. A silence, grassroots, anti-colonial upheaval, if you will. In other words, the plastic power of internally colonized people and their obtuse senses and insurgent archivings can transform our narratives about what really happened and what could have been, illuminating the space where our humanities, always situated, relational, plural, emanate. Since the early days of Jammerthal, photographer Torben Askerud has joined me in the field, becoming my other set of eyes. His camera opened me up to what lay beyond comprehension. By superimposing present and past, he wanted to render sensible the passage of time in that forgotten place of mine. Over the years, as vast tracts of my life receded into oblivion, the surviving images of these forays acquired significant density in my mind, feeding the imagination of the book and the non-linear form it could take. Resisting synthesis, they carry an intensity that writing alone cannot achieve, ensuring the continued surfacing of the unthought. Now, my object of devotion, the Muker songbook, was left unfinished. On the last page, we find the start of a hymn written in the 17th century by Heinrich Schütz, based on Psalm 145. All eyes are waiting for you, Lord, and you give them their food. This stanza Rudolf did not jot down would have read, you open your hand and satisfy the desire of every living thing. The unwritten desire of every living thing. The flashes of transcendence, enjoyment, and beauty that escape Muker history are now ours to sense and our story to tell. This is the main plot of Jammerthal, the Valley of Lamentation, my Muker War. The book is my sincere effort to return to my ancestral home once again, to get to know this landscape differently, perhaps a little bit freer. Thanks so much for the opportunity to share this with you.
Good afternoon. What a joy it's to be here, taking part of the launching of João Biehl's beautiful book, Jammerthal. I thank the Department of Anthropology, Brazil Lab, Michael Mood, always by my side, and João Biehl for the opportunity to continue our ongoing dialogue and engage in our everlasting conversation. This book is a kind of ritual of return, a return to an ancestral home, a return in João's personal but also collective history, a return within academic times, a philosophical return faced with what the author calls a keen sense of mortality. This is a book that carries within it an immense affective and professional way. As we know, its research and writing dates from the period of João's master's degree, but it also traces Biehl's professional trajectory that implies allowing himself to be affected in the sense of feeling home, feeling strangeness, and finally feeling familiarity once again, a kind of anthropological blues. This is also a beautifully written and illustrated book in which the text speaks to and completes itself through photography, a poetic ethnography that crosses times. That is why it speaks of a past embedded in time, a past of the present. It's also a profound anachronistic book, to borrow a concept from Didier Berman. Anachronistic in its philosophical and religious reflections, in its dedication to his son, André, in the memory of Grandma Minda, Vó Minda, and in its preface, which revisits a dissertation completed more than three decades ago. The original text in Portuguese was never published, but it traces a clear line toward João's current research, always following his Mucker War. Not exactly or just the religious and social conflict that took place between 1873 and 1874, involving a group of German colonos and the forces of the Brazilian Empire. Indeed, that was the time of Pedro II, a rather popular emperor who had even visited the region. But at the same time, these were warlike times, and the German immigrants were transformed in internal enemies, far from reasons that they were for reasons that were largely external to them. They used to live in isolation, facing poverty and marginalization, but yet it was a place of belonging, where customs, values, and religious forms were adapted to the local context. In this very unstable context, the term mucker was transformed in a pejorative one used by outsiders who sought to portray what was happening there as a form of messianic and irrational manifestation. That was not quite the case, and what João presents in a new interpretation about a kind of internal war among Germans themselves over the terrain of so-called civilization. The Muckers were attacked with great violence, and dozens of people were killed. This in a country that loved to call itself as peaceful, but was deeply socialized in the perverse and unequal language of slavery, plantation, and intolerance. But Biehl's Mucker's War is of another kind, an internal one, having to do foremost with the return to a past and to a country he thought he had left behind for good. A past he escaped because he foresaw for himself a different destiny, other than, for example, that of a child working in a shoe factory. The dissertation predates João's immigration to the United States and represents a kind of farewell toward a world then unknown to him. As he puts it, it's both a living memorial and his personal insurgency, or as I would say, a way of repairing his colonial ancestry. Brazilian writer Guimarães Rosa once wrote that meaning is found in the process. And João Biehl performs a kind of self-archiving in search of trace of what cannot be known. Thus, reading Biehl's master thesis, as well as following the making of his new book, Mucker Book, led me to think about his notion of an anthropology of becoming. This is also, in Edward Said's words, a book of beginnings, a reclaiming of origins, a war that now entails a kind of armistice with himself. Grandma Minda used to say that you don't do some things with what is your own, and added, in defense of the Mookers, they didn't cut horses' tails. To say that the others cut tails was to assign to them the place of inhumanity, and thus to justify a fair war. In the sense, Mooker was never a category of self-definition. On the contrary, it was an external imposition, one that compelled these people to change their names and homes. There was never justice for the genocide. And silence itself became a form of impunity in time. But not in this book that makes peace with these people and maybe with João. Following these ideas, I'd like to ask you, João, a few questions to spark our discussion. The first ones revisit precisely the subject of time. What does lightly revised means? I personally believe that both people and books can change. The renowned Brazilian historian Sérgio Buarque de Holanda, that Pedro and I studied a lot, wrote Roots of Brazil in 1936, a book now considered a classic in my country. From the first to the last edition, he died in 1982, Holanda introduced small and major changes to his work that became almost a new book. So we all change, João. But I'd like to understand more. What would you say has changed, João? Second, and what has changed not only in the writing, but in the experience itself? Was that place so insulated and closed in 1990? As if time had stopped in that region. What is the situation now? Is still closed off as closed off as it was? Third, in the same vein, I want to ask you, João, about the role of photography in your work. You developed a very special relationship with Torben Eskerode. He is your friend, collaborator, your other pair of eyes, as you put it. But I want to understand who see what? Who see first? Or do you see together? Or afterward? Could you tell us more about this partnership? Photograph here is certainly not an illustration, yet it doesn't quite stand autonomously either. Let me ask in the sense about some photographs. The cover photo. Could you tell us more about Dona Imelda and the way she appears on the cover? In the book, she sells delicious oranges, and eventually she is shown in another kind of situation. But in the selected cover, she looks different. Melancholic, I would say. Her gaze is lowered, and the plate is empty. What does this photography say to you, João? Why her on the cover and with this expression? Finally, I want to ask you about the status of photography within the book. Let's analyze one photograph in particular. In it, we see a group of children in front of an inside house. The house resembles the others in the colony, wooden, whitewashed. Some children are at the window. One looks at the photographer. The one in the middle laughs. She seems to laugh at the central scene. Let's look now at the central scene. Something is happening. The boy at the center acts accordingly of whatever was asked of him. But he's almost laughing. So it's the boy in flip-flops. The boy in the right can barely hold back his laugh. The one below laughs even more. What are these boys laughing at? What other story are they telling? Every photo tells its own story. I'd love for you to tell us more of this one as a pretext for you to talk more about them and their subjectivities. Interesting, the same boy in the striped shirt now appears at school. What are the students seeing? According to Ariella Azulay, photographs are sentinels. They say more than we want them to say. Or sometimes they let us see what we just saw. And because photographs act and intervene directly in reality, they work through style, repetition. But this photograph tells your story and maybe another story. Could it be one of refusal? Refusal of photographs? João, please feel free to answer these questions or not to answer them. I'd simply like to hear more from you and to congratulate you on this book that was your companion for so long in your life. This is the story of yours, of them, and now is ours too. And I thank you for it. Thank you very much, João.
Hi, everyone. It's a difficult task, as you can imagine, to come after Lily, to speak after Lily, but also because I feel I had the great opportunity to ask many questions throughout these years till this book was published, and perhaps too many questions. So today I only have two and a longer comment, but it's such a joy and truly an honor to be here this afternoon with you, so many familiar faces, and also with you, Lily and João. I want to begin by acknowledging what a special moment this is, not only because we are here celebrating a book of a colleague, a book that returns to a vital and forgotten chapter of Brazilian history, one that many Brazilians do not know about, but also because we are witnessing a kind of a homecoming of a text, of an author to an earlier self, and of questions that have accompanied João across decades of work. And these are the good questions, right? The ones that endure. We often speak about books as if they arrive whole, fully formed. But this one has traveled, as we heard from João and from Lily. It has lived different lives. It has gathered layers of thought, memory, and estrangement. And now, after so many years, it comes back to us, and in Portuguese, with the hindsight of an entire intellectual trajectory behind it. And that brings me to two questions I would like to offer as points of entry into today's conversation. The first one is very simple. João, what was the experience of returning to this book after so long? I felt that you spoke about it for 1 minute today in your presentation, and in Portuguese, since you've been publishing in English for so long. And perhaps that connects to Lily's question, why now? In the preface, you describe feeling estranheza, estrangement, and desejo de familiaridade, a will to familiarize. I love that pairing. It captures something essential about scholarly life, in my opinion. How earlier selves feel distant yes, still call to us, the archives that we left behind, or how the archive of our own thinking becomes both foreign and intimate. You describe feeling both estranged from and drawn back into this text's orbit. That duality is very much like one of our favorite writers, W.G. Sebald, would have it. The self meeting its own ghost, recognizing and not recognizing what once compelled it. How was this process? And maybe methodologically, if you still have time, I'd love to hear how is it for you to connect history and anthropology, your own history, to your own kind of doing anthropology. And second, how much of this early work that we re-encounter now continued to shape you, maybe quietly, persistently, as you developed your later scholarship? I ask this because I imagine that most people that are here in this room encountered João through the monumental Vita, in which you also collaborated with Torben, or through the transformative contributions to medical anthropology and ethnography. That's the João Biehl that most readers meet first, but not me. I met João earlier, as you can see in this slide, through the first incarnation of this book, the master thesis he defended in 1991. In fact, I still remember the moment I first saw it. I first saw this dissertation. And just to note, the PDF is not available online because this was before PDFs were a thing. It was during my first year as a research assistant. I was an undergrad, and I didn't know I would become a historian of modern Brazil and its persistent inequalities. At that time, I was spending my days learning to transcribe Gothic German manuscripts at the German Brazilian Studies Hub, or Núcleo de Estudos Teuto-Brasileiros in Portuguese, at my alma mater in southern Brazil. In the middle of that work, you can imagine how boring it was, I found a photocopy of João's thesis in our research group's office. No one quite knew who had brought it or how it had ended up there, but it had almost the aura of a relic, a document that had circulated quietly, hand to hand, because it mattered. Again, no PDFs. We are not sending this through email. Like many people who grew up in the colonies, but were not very aware of their origins, I was always curious about the Mucker War and the conspiracy of silence that followed. When I voiced that to my advisor, he told me I should read João Biehl. And when I did, I understood immediately why he said that. Here was the work of a philosopher turned anthropologist who had thrown himself into archives, so kind of an unusual thing, right? Someone who read traces and silences with equal intensity. Someone capable of turning local histories into violence, belief, desire, and the stubborn life of poor but cosmopolitan communities. We in the southern Brazilian borderlands could never understand why the thesis had never been published. It felt too important and too distinctive to be buried as a manuscript in drawers or shelves. Many years later, when I received a Fulbright to come to Princeton for the first time as a visiting graduate student in the history department just around the corner from here, my parents reminded me, there's this Brazilian anthropologist from here, and here they meant the German colonies, at that university. You should reach out to him. And from that improbable beginning came a collaboration that has deeply impacted my intellectual career. From the Brazil Lab to 2 books we have written together, one already out in the world in German and Portuguese, to articles, conferences, and ongoing conversations that continue to expand how I understand Brazil, archives, and the practice of history, and especially the interfaces with anthropology, and that's why you see myself here in this building so much. I must confess that throughout all these years, the Mucker War never left us. Because as Sebald whispered, and this is another part of that same quotation that you just used, they are still around us, the dead, shaping the paths we take, the questions we ask, and the roads we try to understand. That war became a ghost, yes, but also a compass. a way to navigate the complicated afterlives of the German colonies in southern Brazil with their layers of forgetting and remembering, a guide to reading landscapes for what they reveal and what they conceal, a reminder that history is always fractured, always haunted, always asking us to look again. But there's something else. Years after that first encounter with Jammerthal in its first version, the small research hub where I began my academic life was shut down. Another casualty of Brazil's chronic lack of funding for historical research. When the doors closed, I kept a few remnants of its improvised library. And here, to return to Sebald, I am reminded that, and I quote, despite all assurances to the contrary, we offer our dead only the cheapest substitutes for the diverse beauty of life, end of quote. Among the materials that I saved for myself was that copy of João's thesis. But as some of you know, especially the ones that are closer to me here, the city of São Leopoldo, where I grew up, was devastated by catastrophic floods last year. Entire neighborhoods disappeared underwater. And that fragile photocopy, the relic of my intellectual beginnings and of João's early work, was lost to the waters. Here you see a photo of my library in southern Brazil. A small loss in the face of so much devastation, but a meaningful one. It reminded me that archives, like memories, have their own precarious lives, and that the publication of this book is also an act of restoration, a refusal to let certain histories be washed away. So, João, thank you. Thank you for returning to this project with such care and courage, for bringing it back to life in Portuguese, for giving us not only a book, but the arc of decades of thinking, searching, and becoming. And thank you personally for your generosity, for the intellectual partnership, and for your encouragement to chase the ghosts of our own shared past. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Micaeas and Lily. I will say a few things off the cuff. I really like the process of crafting words and writing, which is something we have so little physical time these days in academia. And Lily and Micaeas are right. I have been writing a longer English version of the Mucker book, which addresses the earlier times before the war. If this is a book that talks about who desired war, the broader work is, what drew people to Jacobina and João Jorge? How was life before the war? So we understand those traces that remain and the crossroads that we can tap into today. And since 2014, Adriana and I have, over the summers, we have returned to New Mexico, to the desert, and I call it a minha roça das palavras, my garden of words, of sorts, in the desert, waking up super. And I always take with me that I have a copy of that first Jammerthal, Vale da Lamentação, and I always felt that there were things there, insights there, that over the years I had abstracted or even cemented, just maybe a bit too much Weber, maybe a bit too much Foucault, right? And I felt that there was some insights there, a rawness, that made me also the anthropologist I am. So it was a farewell to theology, to philosophy, to reason, but it was also a proto-anthropological approach. And last year I was on sabbatical, so I had physical time, and it was the 150th anniversary of the Mucker War and 200 years of the formal beginnings of German immigration to Brazil. So I was approached by the editor of the press. I talked to him, and we thought it would be a good moment to bring this book that had circulated, non-book, that had circulated widely, and it had been the first effort to actually take up the role of the elites in the making of the mucker as such, as a category, as this cursed entity or way of being. So it was a challenge that I was not planning, because I was thinking, I will have to keep working on the other language, other book. But it was, to your question about the returns, what changed. So my mom has been very ill in the past few years, so being in Brazil was also being a bit closer to be able to help, to be available with my siblings and her. But it was also an incredible joy to return to Portuguese. So Portuguese was my second language. I grew up speaking this oral dialect, but I have always enjoyed writing in Portuguese because it has a different association of words. It's like a different flavor when words come together. And in English, I needed to learn subject, verb, object. What do you mean? What is your contribution to this or that? So for me, it was a return to a more associative kind of thinking. And when I returned to that early manuscript, of course, I returned a changed person, right? As you said, the book is dedicated to our son, Andre, for the life he brings. And so it's also with a less phobic relationship to the places I escaped, with a capacity of being able to see the treasures that were given to me over the years by the simple people that cared for me, and that somehow I felt that they were also part of an imprisonment, of an incapacity, of a stuckedness. And to be able to return and to see my past life and the people I work with and the history with this openness to see what was being passed on to me and respect that, not wanting to let that keep dying, so to speak. So it grew in me with my own sense of mortality. And I always told that I wanted to write this book to leave it for our son, for he also to know where he also comes from. So there was that dimension, my own sense of finitude, of mortality. So there are many things, had changed in me. And then when I started to work on the actual, manuscript, I shared it with two colleagues. Luiz Augusto Fischer, an incredible literary critic and writer from southern Brazil. And he said, João, you have to publish this. There's a story here. But he started to send me audios, which became a mini book. And Rodrigo helped me to transcribe like over 50, 60 pages of comments. And he was telling me what was working or what was not working in the older text. And then I worked but also what the reader needed to know that I assumed because I wrote this text at a different time. And I wrote a text and he said, João, you were quite impertinent, he said. Impertinent because I was saying a son of colonists can read Clarice Lispector, can read Octavio Paz, can read Jacques Lacan, can read Laurent Barthes. Is this not the privilege of the elites only? And can read it from a different perspective and do something else with it. So, but it was also, the text was also dated in the way I was fighting with theology and philosophy. So there were several excursions because after all it was a dissertation in anthropological philosophy. So there are several things there that were not working necessarily as a book in light of the story that I just told you. So with Fischer's help, and then Cláudia Laetano, a wonderful journalist and writer, she helped to see my own literary excesses at the time. Just this surplus of ... like a pretense poetic language.
marking an unfinishedness or an openness, right? So we worked together, and that was really amazing because that brought me back also into the Portuguese language in a new way, but it also gave me a sense of which kind of conversations needed to go to the footnotes. And some of you know me, sometimes I use the expression, I'm an evil pragmatist, and I'm the son of a butcher and sausage maker, so I'm not keen to throw too many things away. So even if you look at the footnotes, the things that I removed from the text, they are in the footnotes, because I want to give the reader a sense, if you want to get a sense of the earlier, right? So there is some of that editing, but there is also, as you said, Lily and Michaeus, I learned so much over the years because I started to return to the colonies, to return to my past, to find other archives, to cemeteries, other inscriptions. So I could not pretend that information, those remnants, did not exist. So the book is not, you're wrong, it's not just lightly edited. So all the historiographic, all the new historiographic materials, like the story of the boy Francisco, right? It's all there because I felt that the people today needed to have access to all the archival work, the retrieval, the breaking down of the conspiracies of silences in that text, And then, of course, I also found a way to place myself in the narrative more explicitly, and from the beginning to the end when I bring the story of the songbook. So, photography. That photo that you showed, so the children are actually outside the school. That's the school in Jammerthal. It's a one-room school in Jammerthal. And one of the persons I spoke a lot to was the teacher of that school. And one day he said, why don't you come to the school? And so we went to the school, and they were laughing at Torben, the photographer, because he didn't speak Portuguese. So they were laughing at him. Okay, so they were laughing at him. They were making fun of the foreigner. The little boy who was staring intently, and I'm very proud of that photo because I was telling a story. I was telling a children's story, and by Rubem Alves, the Brazilian theologian, philosopher. And I like storytelling, so I was telling a story. The teacher said, give us something, so I told this story. And I want to tell you now one story of how the book continues, right? How it's unfinished and how the book continues. After the Jammerthal was launched in Porto Alegre a year ago in the book fair, which was the first book fair after the major flooding, which flooded about 80% of the state. It was so incredible to see the book culture so alive there in that moment. In the launch, many people came, to my surprise, to the launch, and we had a photo exhibition as well, including one man whose name was the name of a mucker who is in the book. He has been named by his grandparents to continue the story. So many people came to say, oh, now I'm no longer ashamed, I'm no longer cursed, I want to know the story, So, and many people came to said, I love that you work with home archives, home materials. And then I understood it was because of the flood, people lost so much. And they were holding on to every little thing that spoke to a life they had lived, had desired, a conviviality. And I understood that the book hit a nerve. There's a kind of like a historical fever going on, but of a different kind. It's like a domestic historic fever. People want to tell stories of their families, their ancestors, and relate them to larger world historical processes. Because the official stories, they have been debunked, they have been deconstructed, and they have been pulverized. We have new people doing social science, doing history today. We have Michaeus also, the descendant, coming from a rural area. His grandparents were also agricultural colonists. We have, Afro-Brazilians, blacks. We have many more people who are asking other kinds of questions, finding other folds in history. So I felt that the book came out in Portuguese at the right time. If it had come out at that time, if I had had the courage to send it to Companhia das Letras, which is a publishing house that Lily founded with her husband. And I had that thought before taking the plane. I said, I love this manuscript. Maybe I should send it.
Promise me Vita.
It's
Still
coming.
translated.
It's coming. It's still
Still in its
translated.
words.
It's still translated.
Tell the
Yeah,
story.
yeah. But I didn't send it. So in the end, I'm happy that the book only came out now, you know, because I think everything that happened, as you said, over the years is now there. And I'm able now, with the return to a certain kind of sensibility that is written here, I'm able to now know how the other book in English will end. You know, I didn't know how that book will end. That book is a larger book, and I was struggling with the final chapter. Now I know how it will end. So books are unfinished. I like that idea a lot. So one last thought about the photograph, and then I want to open to hear at least some of your questions. After the launch of the book in Porto Alegre, I also did a launch of the book in Picada Café, the little town, the rural town where I was born. And Jammerthal is part of Picada Café. It's the most remote colony. Of course, my mom was so proud. She came, she lives nearby in the rural area. And the first two persons who came are two women, Marlise and Liri. One is blind, Marlise and Liri. The last time Adriana and I had saw them was when we had our wedding celebration in Brazil in the end of the 90s. We had a party there in the colonies. And they came and they brought the photo of that celebration, even though Marlise was blind. They came with their sister. And then I learned that they were the woman who took care of me as a child when my mom couldn't. My mom was struggling with severe depression. She was 19 years old. She had 2 children. She wanted to kill herself. And that was so striking that this return reconnected with another dimension of my existence. And as we are discussing in our Home Places seminar, we never belong only to one house, but to a multiplicity of houses, right? And so not just the dead keep returning, but the people who somehow imprinted something in you, they keep returning because you are somehow part of their lives, and they are, even though if you don't think or remember, part of their lives too. So now I'm writing something about that which is part of the unknown or the unthought, which I'm calling, the accidental child, mapping the beginnings that were not meant to be. But so somehow the story continues, but the book occasioned that possibility, right? And at that night when I gave a little talk in Picada Café, I showed these photos. I showed the photos of the children, and this photo of the little boy, and in the background, there is a little girl in that photo. She's in the background. And because of social media, even in these rural places, right? So someone was sending photos of what was going on there, me in front of the photo, and put it on Instagram in real time. And that night, that girl, who is now a woman in her 40s, contacted the Secretary of Culture of the little town saying, "That's me. I am in that photo. I had a tragic life. I had to leave Jammerthal. My mom died. My brother died. I needed to make my life in another place. And I have been reaching out to all of those kids, asking for a photo of my childhood. I had no photo of my childhood. And now I am in a book. So it's interesting. So the books have many lives, and so I'm happy to have collaborated with Torben over the years. I can say a lot. There's a lot of love, a lot of fight when you work with artists. But artists see something that I at least cannot see. So many of the photos I curated, of course, right? I produced. Torben, what about this, that, look at this, etc. But now when I went here, I asked Torben to go back. This is pre-digital cameras, to go back to his negatives, so to speak. So he scanned all the negatives of those early days there. And what drew me most in are the things that I didn't curate. it's things that kind of found its eyes entered into his camera. Yeah. So I think our collaboration is continuous, you know. But Imelda, one final word. We love Imelda. We love Imelda. Adriana is there. We love Imelda. And we, over the years, we have returned to Jammerthal. We took Andre when he was little. He loved walking through her garden and throwing stones into the river. And her husband passed away. That photo is an early morning photo, this photo. And this plate is food for the birds. So there is, you know, there is a melancholy there, right? But there is this love as well, you know. She didn't have children, you know. This is something she mourned somehow. But in some ways, you know, I stayed, of all the people I interviewed, she's still alive, but she has Alzheimer's. But she, over the years, is the person that I visited most and stay in contact with. So I just felt that for me and her husband, who passed away many years ago, you know, they kind of encapsulated some of that, both looking through the, who are they? You know, who are you? The fear, you know, the fear, are you trying to get something on me? But at the same time, an immense wisdom and joy as well. You know, so I will stop here. Do we have time for any questions, Mikael?
Time for
Okay.
one round.
One round, okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Let's start with Ash.
Yeah. Yeah, same.
Please, we will gather the bundles to honor our author today. So 3 or 4 questions.
Muito obrigado pela palestra fantástica. I'm a comparativist at UPenn, and I work on Eastern European and Russian colonos in Brazil. And I'm really curious how this history you're outlining is a history of dispossession, history of marginalization, but also based on this larger history of fullness, of occupation, of creation, of violence. And I'm curious how you work within, you brought up this concept of white negro. I'm also curious how you think about this concept of colono, at the same time representing this marginalized class, but at the same time having this literal legacy of the colonial grandeur that Brazil is marketing itself towards Europeans. So I'm curious how you, in your poetic philosophizing about this period, are thinking about this issue.
Hi, I'm one of those Brazilians Mikael mentioned who didn't know about this, so thank you for the learning experience. It's always exciting to learn something new. And you were mentioning about this multiplicity of homes, and you did mention a word that I do know, that's quilombo. That's part of my research. So I'm just curious of how do you envision these connections between this community and the quilombos? Like, what are the similarities? Like, what do you see in the quilombos that connects to these communities? Thank you.
I have many questions, but I'd like to first also thank all of you for your wonderful, wonderful, very exciting, very meaningful, I don't have the words, certainly not in English, to thank you enough. More importantly, I have many questions, which I will not ask now, but I have one question that I'd like to ask, which is at the end of my paragraph. I have one paragraph to introduce the question, and then that's it with the question. So when I learned just last week that I'll have the opportunity today to hear the introduction of your book, I naturally did what I always do when a situation like that arises, and I started looking for a way to get a copy of the book. So I went immediately to Labyrinth, and they couldn't even raise it on their internet. So I ended up with a team of very nice, very capable helpers, 3 of them. And they did everything possible to go to all their sources on the internet to figure out where this, and I gave them the full name. I even gave I think the publisher is called Okos Publisher, which in Hungarian, by the way, means wise, Okos, wise. So that publisher, they couldn't find it. No one could find it. So I said, okay, I will have to go to Amazon. I hate to do that, but I'll do that. So my wife decided to, say, okay, I will look for you in Amazon. No sign of it, nowhere. So then I have a reader's card at the Library of Congress and one at the Mercer County, library, as well as Firestone, of course, as an alumnus. No one could help me. I said, but I see it in the window, and the anthropology, the burn.
Where is the book?
And it's in Portuguese, should I go to Düsseldorf or what should I do?
Okay.
I had 4 days in which to buy it and read it and then digest it. No one could help me. So my question is, how can I get it?
Okay, we have one more and then it's one. Yeah, great. Thank you. Great.
Hi, thank you so much for the fascinating talk. I wanted to ask you, how do you probe the relation between faith and sickness in the book? I know that you said that theology is less of has less of a big role in this version of it, but I was very stricken by what you said, that the Munkers weren't really a messianic community, and at the same time you said that, I think your grandfather said that Jacobina was just like Christ. Of course that can have like 2 meanings, Christ as like the Son of God, or Christ just the person who does miracles because he heals people. But I wanted to ask about that, and if there's still time, I also wanted, you mentioned briefly the relation of the Munkers with the people who were mutilated in the Paraguayan War, is that right?
Yes.
And yeah, I wanted to ask about that.
Okay, well, these are beautiful questions. I will thank you for staying. We want to celebrate together, and thank you for your patience, but I will try to respond them. Starting from your question. So the book was published by this incredible, it's a small press, it's a local press in southern Brazil. The wonderful designer Lula Rocha, who did all our designs for the Brazil Lab and for anthropology, designed the book. If you can have a sense to see, you'll see it's a beautifully designed book. So the book is, you can access Oikos. If you're in Brazil, you can get a copy of the books, via the Oikos website. I will deposit 2 or 3 copies at the library here, and there is one small excerpt in English which is close to the materials that I'm currently working on the book, and which a lot of it is in the Portuguese edition. It's in the current anthropology journal. It's called Insurgent Archivings, so you can get something of this there. Yeah, and in Portuguese, in anti-colonial archivings in Mana, a Brazilian anthropology journal. So you can try to find that there. Okay. So I will start maybe with your last question. I never wanted to put myself in the position to say what was happening when Jacobina had her trances, because I couldn't be there, right? So my job was more, what did people take back to their homes and communities from that experience of transcendence, the divine, and healing? So that was always my stake. And somehow that was fantastic, because even that man, his grandfather has said, the Munkar went there and celebrated. So there was a sense that it was a space of commensality, conviviality, etc., etc. As I continue to work, and I'm still working on this, I'm finding the local community registers, the Lutheran parish registries, that even though they had no legal value, they were not, Brazil was a Catholic country until the Republic and a few decades later.
But still they insisted, even though most of them were illiterate, semi-literate, even though they were laymen, they insisted in leaving inscribed their vital registries. And they left incredible information about the mourning around the dead person, how families gathered, the causes of death, where the funeral took place, or a person, a woman who was the godmother of someone who then was suffering and threw herself in fire, and then what the neighbors did. So they're complex stories, human stories, and they pass through religion. They pass through a kind of a domestic form of religion. Most of the experience of religion before the missionaries came were in homes. So I call this like an oiko-ecclesia. It was a domestic form of church. And they brought that kind of domestic spirituality and religiosity to their communal buildings. So I also studied the foundation of those early churches. And in Picada Café, my ancestors, Carl Biehl, actually helped to found the Lutheran community of Picada Café, in which I was even, and then Andre later baptized. We did a ritual for him there as well. So there is something about this domestic form of religiosity that is linked with a neighborliness, but it's linked also with caring for the dead. That was one of the most striking discoveries, how people wanted to keep the dead nearby. Even when they created communal cemeteries before the missionaries came, they said, but who will take care of the dead? We need to put a wall here so that the cattle does not go in there and desecrates this space, right? So there is something that I've still not figured out, but there is definitely something of a domestic form of religiosity, a spirituality that's linked to nature, to reckoning with the dead, that animated or drove people to the Mucker. I think death worked as an actant in that context. I gave you a sense, you mentioned the Paraguayan War. Miqueias is an expert. He wrote an amazing book that's going to be released shortly on the recruitment of young German descent, children born of German immigrants. So the early idea of a military agricultural colony was fruitful, because when Brazil needed this army, it was there. And this was the first time that those families had to deal with mourning without having a physical body to bury. So at that time, lo and behold, one of the first families to join the Mucker was a family whose son had died in the Paraguayan War, the Schnell family, and they actually were mourning the death of their son around the trances of Jacobina. So there's definitely something. But anyway, the most I can do is try to recuperate a little bit what that social world was, the cultural mutations, the social cataclysm, right? And all this happened in a context in which missionaries were coming in and creating orthodoxy. They were disciplining bodies, they were disciplining minds, and they were basically disavowing the lay priesthood, which is a practice that continued way into the early 20th century. So there's a lot, but the missionaries, they were in cahoots with the Germanist elites, as I mentioned. So there was a complex process in which people had developed a kind of a symbolic order, a form of religiosity. They experienced a certain kind of transcendence, had a capacity for it. And that kind of was supplanted, by a different way of understanding yourself as an ethnic, racialized, German religious subject. And the Mucker War was the element in which that kind of got crystallized. To your question about the quilombos, that's a new finding. There had never been before, and thanks to Miqueias, who, if there is anything left in the archives of power of a different kind of storytelling, he finds it.
So Miqueias was able to find those were kind of dispatches. They had been sealed and they had been opened, and we were able to identify this. And so in some ways, our sense now is that the violence against the Mucker was intimately linked with the fear of the plantation lords of the surrounding plantations and farms, fazendas, that they would have a copycat effect, the insurrection of the Mucker. So that's one way. But then when we found this remnant of the little boy, Francisco, there as a spoil of war. So there were blacks there, maybe runaway slaves, maybe freed blacks, they were there. Because the other book that we did shows a lot the presence of black people and enslaved and free blacks in the colonies. That's a story that Miqueias also began to open up in the mid-2010s. So definitely in those church registries, you see a pastor baptizing at the same time a black girl, Henriette, with a white boy, forgot the name, Johannes, maybe. So the question of how those communities were able to normalize captivity, this community of saints, And in some ways what I do in the book, in the larger book, is I try to trace where I can find the presence of possible exchanges between those colonos and blacks. Because we know that blacks were holding precious medicinal, therapeutic knowledge, right? So the question also, where did the knowledge come of João Jorge, of the medicinal herbs, So there's something about indigenous communities, something was passed on there that they were able to, deal with. But to the first question, Dan, that you asked, when I was with my Hunsrückische dialect, when I went to Berlin, to the archives of the Lutheran Church, to the missionary societies, I was in shock, because the first report said of the missionaries, there is no religiosity here. So in the beginning, there is erasure. So that's the beginning. And that then culminates 10 years later with the Mucker War, right? So, and then lo and behold, in his studying the missionary reports, who was in charge of the missionary societies that helped Protestants in America and in South America? Friedrich Fabry, who was the idealizer of German territorial colonialism. And he wrote a manifesto in 1878. Basically, he was one who said, we need tribes that think and trade in Germany. So I started to understand that the German colonies in southern Brazil, they were a proto-experiment of German colonialism, but not through territorial annexation, but through ethnic colonization, or re-Germanization. And the lessons learned later would, be transferred to the Pacific, to Namibia, et cetera, right? So that story had never been told before, right? But at the turn of the century, with the success of the Germanist elites, 15% of all the exports and imports of southern Brazil were with Germany. So it was a very robust, trade operation that was put into place. The Brazilian government, and Lily here, she's our imperial counter-imperial historian here. She wrote a book about Dom Pedro. Brazil in the 1860s was also struggling with how to deal with enslaved labor. Pressures from England to abolish slavery was very gradual in Brazil, way too late. So they had this idea that they could whiten the labor force. There was no more, they could no longer buy enslaved people from Africa. The traffic was banished, but internal traffic or trade continued widely. A third of people in southern Brazil, who is also always portrayed as a white state, were of blacks, of descendants of enslaved people. So the question of immigration was central to what modern Imperial Brazil would be. So there was a kind of a connectivity between the creation of the German Empire in 1873 in its proto stages via Prussia, and the own politics of the Brazilian Empire, who needed to find alternative in terms of its relationship with agriculture, labor force. And there was this whole debate, where should they come from, right? So should they come from Asia? But then the discrimination about the yellows, as they were called, the Chinese. So the Germans and the Italians were the favored ones. And then later came the Polish, right? So the Eastern Europeans, they came later. The Japanese came during the coffee plantation boom, also in the late 1800s, right? São Paulo as well. So the story of Brazil from the perspective of immigration and the borderlands has not yet been fully taught. We tend to think Brazil from the perspective of the colonizer, and rightly so. Now we are learning to read the story from the perspective of the millions of enslaved people who came to Brazil, and also for the indigenous people who were dispossessed. But there are those other stories and other language that make up for this complex Brazilian history, right? That in some ways continue and might offer some possibilities of thinking of a different kind of narratives that's more inclusive, and that somehow breaks open, space for different peoples understanding themselves as part of something, of a commons, rather than just being the nichts, the nothings. How are we doing, guys?
I think we are out of time, but we can continue the conversation over snacks and drinks just outside. There's a reception, and then if you have questions, you can come to João.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, ladies. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.